I was enjoying this conversation, but we have to have a conversation that's probably even more serious and less enjoyable because it's very, very real and very, very sad. It's Ebro in the Morning, Laura Stiles and Rosenberg, and we have Baz Dreisinger. Am I saying the last name right?
You got it.
Boom.
Baz Dreisinger. I don't want to be. I don't want to screw anything up by trying to run through your accolades and accomplishments prior to the completion of this book, Incarceration Nation. So, for the audience, can you talk about the amazing things that you've done in work as it pertains to incarceration and criminal justice in your career?
Thank you. Thank you for the compliment.
problem.
So I'm a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice here in New York, in Manhattan. And I started a program there called the Prison to College Pipeline, which is essentially a college program at Otisville Correctional Facility, about 2 hours from the city. And so we basically, we offer college classes and we work with people coming home from prison, and then we just try to spread the gospel of higher education in prisons and also among people coming home from prison.
And that kind of reentry process and what do they call it? Reformative justice? Is that reentry, and then there's reformative justice is a whole other thing that I've noticed that you wrote about in your book, and I keep hearing is kind of a buzzword nowadays about how that's not a thing and it doesn't work.
About restorative justice?
Restorative justice,
yes. So restorative justice is kind of the opposite of what we do in our system right now, which is all about punishment and harming people and the kind of eye for an eye approach. Whereas restorative justice is trying to look at things a little bit differently. How can we talk about reparations and restoring instead of talking about punishment and revenge and so on?
So your book, Incarceration Nation, you traveled everywhere studying jails.
Yep. Prisons mainly.
Prisons mainly. But what did you see around the world that it's different than here in America?
Well, first of all, listen to the places that you went.
Yeah.
What are the places you went to go see prisons?
So I went to Rwanda, South Africa, Uganda, Jamaica, Thailand, Brazil, Australia, Singapore, and Norway.
And then I was talking to her behind the scenes.
I peeped Norway.
I was curious about how much access she got in these jails.
So it really ranged. In some countries, when I was kind of a guest of the government, as in Singapore, it was pretty limited. I was able to go in there and talk to some people, but it was constantly under the watch of the government, basically.
Of course.
But there were other countries where I had a lot more access. Thailand, I had a good amount of access. I was working with the Princess of Thailand in women's prisons. She actually runs an organization to help women in prison in Thailand and around the world. I had a good amount of access in Uganda. I ran this creative writing class in Uganda, and they pretty much let me do the work that I wanted to do.
And how long would you go for to a place like that?
It ranged depending on the access. So I spent a while in Rwanda. I spent about a couple months there, and I also spent a couple months in Uganda, and then other trips were shorter. In Jamaica, I only went for the day. I went to look at this music program in prison in Kingston, a pretty famous prison in Kingston. So it depended on the access.
And does the book reflect that? Are like the chapters and focus longer of the places that you spent more time?
Yeah, for sure. The Jamaica chapter actually is together with the Uganda chapter for a bunch of reasons, because each chapter kind of has a theme, and that one is about the arts in prison. So I talk about writing programs and theater programs, and music programs are a big thing throughout the world. So I looked at this reggae program in Jamaica.
What did you see was the difference between what you know of our criminal justice system and what you saw abroad?
So for one, there's a lot of similarities. There's probably more similarities than differences, which is, number one, I mean, the whole system of prisons, from their architecture to the idea of the way that we use prison to deal with our social problems, is an American idea that was essentially, foisted on the rest of the world. So it was a really crazy thing to be in these countries that are seemingly so different from us, and then you pull up to the prison and it looks like I'm in upstate New York. So it's like they're copying the model from the physical sense, but also in the whole way that it's being used. And then it's also, there's these similarities in terms of who's being locked up in these countries, which is generally people of color or others, however that country might define it. So you're talking about Black folks in Brazil, or blacks and quote-unquote colored people in South Africa, or you're talking about certain ethnic groups in Thailand. So it's like you define this group as, the other, and then you criminalize them and incarcerate them.
Is it usually poor?
Poor as well, definitely. Yeah. It's poor and it's racialized in certain countries. In other countries like Uganda, it's very much about money. Can you afford the bribe to get out? So there's an unbelievable similarity to what happens in this country.
So now the conversation as we enter the election and we're in the primary process, you're hearing a lot about Hillary's past and, her husband and decisions that were made on his watch with regard to our criminal justice system and mass incarceration. And when he came into office, what was going on in the country and the amount of young black men that got put away. And then you obviously had 3 strikes and people getting felonies and 3 felonies, you're doing life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Your book delves into this kind of, it's a part of the fabric of who we are now here in America.
Big time.
I mean, like everyone you know has probably been or has a relative that's been to jail at some point in their lives, right? I mean, that's kind of a part of our culture now.
It's been a part of our culture from the birth of this country historically, and it is now. I mean, if you don't know someone who's locked up, you definitely know someone who has a parent or a child who's locked up, certainly in New York City. I mean, it's obviously impacting certain communities more than others, but is growing, and it's spreading like a plague. And this is starting to be true around the world, which is part of why I wrote the book. I mean, we are the world's biggest jailer. We have 25% of the prison population is American. Of the worldwide prison population is American, with only 5% of the world's population. So we're
over-indexing there.
We are.
How many millions do we have in jail?
We have 2.3 million in prison, but we have more people. The numbers are much larger when you think about correctional supervision in general. So just, people under the watch of the criminal justice system. And that number is actually larger. There are more people of color under criminal supervision today in America than there were slaves at the height of slavery. That's how bad the numbers are.
What drew you to this as something to be interested in and focus on with your life?
Well, it was a combo of factors. But what actually, I grew up in the Bronx. I grew up in New York City. It wasn't a foreign entity to my life growing up. But what started me with education in prison is actually hip hop, funny enough. I was writing, I'm a journalist too, and I was writing for a lot of publications, the LA Times and Vibe back when, and I was writing about issues that dealt with criminal justice and hip hop, and I did these films around. I did 2 documentary films around this.
And one about the hip hop cops.
Yep, the hip hop cops.
Where can we see that documentary, by the way?
They're all on Netflix. That one's called Black and Blue: Legends of the Hip Hop Cop, and it was based on an article I did for Vibe in the early 2000s. And then there's another one called Rhyme and Punishment about hip hop and the prison system. And because of those things, and I also did some stuff in Jamaica prior to going to the prison. I did some work on Jacquior, who was a reggae artist. He just got nominated for a Grammy, and he spent a bunch of years inside and started recording music inside. And so I started getting all these letters from people in prison, actually, in my office at John Jay, who had read my articles or heard about the film. And one thing led to another, and I just started going up there. This was about 12 years ago. I just started going up there and leading classes. I mean, they were writing to me, begging me to come in and bring some kind of intellectual life to the place. And so that's what I did. And then that led to starting the program. I think it's the kind of thing where once you go inside and once you really see this on a grand scale and you sit in a room with hundreds of people who are locked up, who are brilliant minds, who are not being used in society the way they, and not being given the opportunity to exist in the world and contribute to society, then it becomes an obsession. I mean, it did for me, and I think that's true for a lot of people.
How do you separate people, and I don't even know how, there's so many, it's very deep, so I'm oversimplifying, so just play along for the sake of the conversation. But you go in these prisons, you wrote this book, Incarceration Nation. I think we would all sit here and agree that there are some people who deserve to be behind bars, yes?
There are people who need to be segregated from the rest of society, yeah. I think I'd put them in...
And how you deal with them is kind of where your mind is at.
Exactly. And I also think that that's not the bulk of the people who are in the criminal justice system, which is the problem, right?
And that's where I wanted to go.
Right. See, the thing is that we often talk about it as if the bulk of the criminal justice system is a bunch of Marilyn Mansons and, all of these...
lunatics, and
killers,
murderers, and
Jeffrey
people
Dahmers,
people, yes.
and so on. But that's not really the bulk of people who are in there. For the most part, you're talking about people who are. Obviously, there's the drug offender issue, but also even among people who are quote unquote violent offenders. Often, you're talking about people who committed a crime in the context of all kinds of problems growing up at the age of 17 or 18, and now they're 45 and still serving time. And we give out the longest sentences in the world. No one else can compare to us. Where I was in the world, even in some of the worst places, like the hellhole of a Brazilian prison or a Jamaican prison, people will look at me and say, I can't believe you guys have life in prison. That's not common around the world. having the death penalty is not common around the world. So it's a really crazy thing to be in what feels to you like this crazy hellhole and have people look at you and say, I can't believe your country does X, Y, and Z.
Can you talk to me about rehabilitation after when you're coming out of the system? Because I know that I'm not sure, like certain countries in like Europe, they're really when it comes to, I guess, is it victimless crimes? Like you said, that they help them really become functioning individuals and going back into society.
Right. And
Do you cover that in the book?
Definitely. I mean, I actually kind of hate the word rehabilitation because it implies that people were habilitated in the first place. And when we're talking about most of the people in prisons around the world, we're talking about people who are in some ways conditioned to be in those prison cells and those
You're
jail
talking about them
cells.
completely starting over again. They never
they
had
never had the opportunity in
starting
the
point.
first place, right? So rehabilitation implies like, oh, we need to, do this again. But and we do call it a Department of Corrections. So theoretically, that's what we're supposed to be doing, right? Correcting, rehabilitating. So and we fall short of that dramatically. I mean, my program is about that. I think I'm a big believer in education. So certainly, I think education is the way to rehabilitate people, give them the opportunities to be in the classroom in ways that most of the people in there were not. But in general, in a lot of the other countries that I went to, there was a more accepting attitude toward people coming home from prison. Definitely true in Norway, very progressive place, but it's also true in Rwanda, which is a country that went through a genocide and still is preaching this doctrine of reparations and forgiveness instead of punishment and harm. And then it was amazing to see the kinds of programs that exist. Australia has some pretty amazing educational programs and different kinds of programs that are happening. So I didn't only focus on the horror shows in these different places. There's a lot we can learn by thinking globally. And, we kind of have to think globally because it's a global problem.
Does it scare you that the current Republican nominees who exist, obviously they scare us all for 1,000 reasons, but can you imagine? Listen, Democrats who we like are far enough viewpoint-wise from probably a lot of your views. Can you imagine how far away you would be from even this? And this is where I'd probably put almost all of them in the same category: Cruz, Trump, Rubio, whoever. The way that they would view the criminal justice system. I mean, these are candidates like this would want to just kill everyone they could, get rid of as many people as they could. The idea of caring about their feelings is something they could not even wrap their head around.
And providing social services for people so as to prevent people from ending up in prison in the first place would be alien to them. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying. And I look at all of it. I think even with the Democrats, I'm looking at it skeptically because there's actually a lot of talk among Republicans and Democrats about this issue. And Republicans are really interested in it because they're worried about money. So they want to cut down the prison population too because it's really expensive. We spend a lot of money.
Wait, they stopped making money on the prison industrial complex? Those stocks aren't good anymore?
The private prison companies are making money, but the states are losing money. They're throwing away their budget, locking people up,
and then prisons.
Right, yeah.
How many of our country's prisons, and state, federal, I don't know, are private, and how many are state or federal funded? Well, is there a number? Because Laura actually asked me this question. I didn't have an answer.
Well, it can be unclear. Actually, we know that the private prison company is $1 billion entity.
But we don't know how many they own.
If you go state to state, you can definitely figure it out. But some states don't allow private prisons. New York, for instance, we don't have private prisons.
So they're all state owned and run.
In New York, yes. Although we also have, there are federal prisons as well, but it's all government run. But the thing to remember though is that, people like to make that state-private prison distinction, but there's a lot of overlap there because the prison industrial complex exists in the state system too. Think about phone companies, the cost of prison phone calls, which a lot of people are talking about now. Think about where the food is coming from and the prison labor that's happening. Whole Foods was just caught in this whole scandal about, how are you going to be liberal Whole Foods and you're using prison labor. So it's not so, the ways that money and the prison system are all mixed up exists across the board. It's not only, the private prisons are just especially scary because of how much control they have over our government. Their lobbying power is terrifying. They can, they're pushing for really strict sentencing guidelines and all the rest because they need people in their prisons for sure. We don't have that in New York State, but we have a whole lot of other ways that we're involving capitalism in our prison system.
What about the fact that, for years since I first learned about the death penalty and became against it, staunchly against it, I always heard the argument about how much cheaper it is to kill inmates, but factually that's just not ever true either.
No, it's definitely not. I mean, for one, to keep someone on death row is really expensive. It's a really high supervision unit, so it costs a lot of money. The cost of execution is unbelievable. But at the end of the day, it's like, how dare we talk about costs? We're talking about human lives. And so whenever I hear the Republicans or the bipartisan folks coming together around this issue, I mean, it's nice that there's some really conservative people now talking criminal justice reform. That's great to hear. But if it's all about money, you'll find a cheaper way to lock people up or segregate people or find ways of oppression that are cheaper. So it's got to be based on something more than just how can we do this for a low cost.
I just want to say God bless people like you for doing this work.
No, seriously.
No, seriously. No, real talk. Because, I guess, and this is part of my flaw, is, my dad was he was in the prison system most of his life on and off, right? He was a 3-time felon, had shock treatments in Vacaville for behavior and was violent and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the men in my family went to jail. And I was raised to know that either you're going to follow the rules or you're going to be in jail. Those are your options when you're when you're a black man, but don't be over 200 pounds tall and be, demonstrative and animated in any way and don't have emotions that could potentially get you in trouble, right? And the reason I say that is because now, fast forward, I've already succumbed to the reality that as great as our nation is, it's one of the great ones, this reality of capitalism and how we deal with human life is a function of how much most people in this country only give a fuck about them and theirs. And if you're going to make a decision in America that is potentially going to send you down a path where you're not going to be able to come back from, oh well, right? But I was raised to think that because the men that came before me, it was like, listen, we tried some things, that didn't work out so well. So you know what you're going to do? You're going to go to school, you're going to get a job, you're going to save your money, and you're going to focus and not get your motherfucking ass in trouble, and that's how you'll survive.
That's what you did.
And that's what I mean, 41, I don't have a criminal record and I've never been to jail. So
But what you're saying it makes you feel bad that because you adopted that, you don't really think about it beyond that. You just go, just do that.
And that makes me selfish. And that's why I say God bless people like her who are going a step further, who actually care about human life.
There are people who did go wrong, and that doesn't mean they deserve to be thrown in the garbage for the rest of their life.
And there are people like her that give a fuck still, right? Because, I see young minorities on the train in New York or standing on the corner or out front of their own houses. And unfortunately, sometimes, and I've said it on the radio, you guys will be like, yo, Ibra, you're an asshole. I'll be like, yo, my man, check this out. Your block is bad. It sucks you can't hang out outside and get lumped in with the bad behavior that's going on outside, and you're a kid. You're a child. But being outside, having a good time with your friends may result in death, going to jail, and God forbid you make a mistake like thinking you're cool and you're going to sell a little weed or something to, ba bang, bing, done.
It
right?
is,
and that same behavior in a suburban life, you might get a slap on the wrist, your dad or mom knows someone, and boom, maybe you go through a little
I know
treatment.
So many people like that, though, who have weed offenses in high school, got washed away. It's nothing. And of course, just like would be the case with most people on the other side of the block, it meant nothing. It meant nothing. It was no indicator of who they were as a person. It was a mistake.
Right.
But you're not afforded that luxury of making mistakes.
Right.
In these neighborhoods.
Absolutely not. And it's terrifying. I'm glad you said that, because it's so easy to get caught in the crosshairs of our criminal justice system, especially if you are black and brown and in New York City or another urban center. I mean, it's like that. And then once you are already caught, it's unbelievably easy to then get sucked in again.
And the story I just told you guys, putting it that way, is the anger that you see in a teenage boy, right, black or brown, that feels that pressure that I can't fuck up one little nothing in my life and nobody gives a fuck about me anymore. And complicate that with, I'm from a single parent home, or complicate that with any teenage hormonal emotional journey that you're on, and the next thing you know, your life is over forever.
Or you're in Rikers, which is essentially the same thing. Because, you get thrown in Rikers these days is absolutely, every day is a risk that you could die, because that's how bad Rikers is nowadays.
Rikers is that bad now, huh?
Rikers is a blot on the face of New York City. There's the level of violence there is frightening. I had a student recently, actually, he's a student who's a college student. He came out of our program. He's doing great. He's an honor student. He's pre-law. He's studying philosophy, all these wonderful things. He's still on parole. And he gets picked up on a minor parole violation and thrown in Rikers. He was stuck there for over a month waiting to see the judge. Which is low. That's a low number compared to what people are waiting.
A month is a low number.
A month is a low number. Now, every day he's calling me and he's saying, please get me out of here. I'm going to die. The gang violence is so intense. Nobody's sleeping, right? Because they're afraid of what's going to happen if you go to sleep. They're standing up. They're sleeping standing up because the gang violence is so intense. Now, not only is that, you're putting this person's life at risk every day he's in there, but you're also screwing with everything that he's accomplished up to that point. He almost lost his job. He almost failed the semester. He had a full-time job at a law firm, ironically. So this is somebody who's obviously doing incredible things in the world.
What was the parole violation?
It was a DWI of which he's innocent, because he fought the case. He got himself a good lawyer, which is a rare thing. Most people end up locked up. They can't pay the bail, or, bad lawyering. It's not that dramatic. So, and ultimately he got out. He's all right. But he had support. He has support from his professors. He had support at school, from family. But lots of other people are in his shoes, and then some. And that's on some small thing.
By the way, that's such an interesting thing that's coming around full circle to us, because even with someone who we know in our life, who met us and has had hiccups with the law, and the only way that has been able to avoid it becoming a real problem is the fact that we know people and lawyers and ways to help. If you don't have those connections to people, you're up shit's creek.
Listen, we're talking about a 22-year-old whose mother and sister put her name in their drama.
Yeah, and that's how, and by the way, that's not an uncommon thing.
No, it's not uncommon.
Even though she's the person who takes care of the family's kids, the niece and nephew, which she takes care of, she ends up getting her name thrown on something, ends up in trouble, blah, 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 is getting pulled in.
Police at the door, et cetera.
Police at the door, doesn't know what to do. And, thank goodness, worked for us, and now is able to call us and say, what can I do? How can I get help? And then you have to spend money, and then you need to help. And people who don't have that, I don't know what would happen.
And also, because this just made me think about the Khalif Broward story. After that young man was in jail for so long, getting raped and abused, and at the end, he finally gets out and commits suicide because he could never deal with the demons and the horrible violence that he dealt while he was in the prison system.
The trauma is
for something that he was innocent the entire time.
Yep, and that's the that's the thing about Rikers too, right? As opposed to the state system, is the fact of how many people in there, how many thousands of people are not even convicted of anything and are subject to those kinds of conditions. Right here in the most progressive city in the world, right in the heart of it too. And the reality about Rikers, and the thing that's also so sort of crazy about it, is that so many people in the city don't even know where Rikers is or how to get there.
It's right there.
Right? But you know if you've had to go. But if
Yeah.
you don't, so it's a way of like keeping, and I actually found this around the world too, it's a way of like hiding people in plain sight. So it's right there, but you can't see it.
I think the essence of this conversation goes back to what we all believe this country's potential is, and we've been programmed to believe this country's potential is, versus us actually addressing the hundreds of years of problems that have just been swept under the rug under the guise of, but America's great though. Aren't you happy to be here? You should just be happy to be here and be accepted. And I always say to people, well, what if your boyfriend or your girlfriend said that to you? Because it's a relationship. We all live here. Live in this society, this community. It's a relationship, right? We have a relationship with each other. We have a relationship with the cops, the government, et cetera. It's all of these relationships. And what if your loved one said to you, you should just be happy to be a part of this family?
Yeah.
Or you should just be happy that, whatever the scenario is, and forget the past. Forget that I cheated on you and I put my hands on you and I raped you potentially and I, took you places, against your will. Forget all that. That's not important. It's about the now and it's about moving forward.
That's the perfect comparison. And actually, it's a good way to put it, too, because this is not about hating on America and going, it's about saying, okay, how can we make this better? How do we, and also, how do we take responsibility? Because we've created this mess in our country. As I write about in the book, we then, put it on the rest of the world in all kinds of ways and influence the rest of the world to do this. So it's kind of our responsibility to be better. And this is a nation of innovators. There's a lot of smart people in this country. There's a lot of innovators. We do a lot of great things, especially when it comes to capitalism and making money. So, all right, let's figure out a better way to deal with things than this very lazy system of justice that is just, throw people in jail.
It's a one-size-fits-all approach, which is also our public school system, which is a whole other conversation.
A lot of comparisons there, though, in terms of that conversation.
So let's go a little farther into mass incarceration and what took place in the late 80s and the 90s, which I'm sure you studied, ad nauseum, right? What is your opinion of Hillary Clinton? Or the Clintons, let's call it that, because she was the first lady. So people say, well, that's her husband made those decisions when he was cutting deals and doing whatever he was doing.
So, her husband made some really important decisions, which I'm glad all of that is being talked about in the context of the election, because mass incarceration really, really started booming in the late 80s, early 90s. And actually, Clinton passed a 1994 crime bill that really was decimated college programs in prison, did all kinds of really harmful things as far as sentencing laws, and that produced the problem that we have today. And that was her husband, that wasn't her, but she went around making all kinds of statements of support for that bill. She was the one who was talking about the super predators and so on and so forth, and creating this image of these super predators who are coming after you, who need to be locked up and contained. So she definitely supported this. Now, so did a lot of people at that time, unfortunately, and that's being used as an excuse. Well, everybody supported these things. Yeah, but I expect more from my politicians. This is just because everyone was supporting it, or that was the discourse of the time, that's how everyone was talking at the time. That's not okay. I want a politician who's going to think beyond what everyone is talking about.
And I'll take it, I've said this too. A lot of black politicians supported that. A lot of what my dad used to call assimilators, because, in the late 60s, you had the Panthers and you had people who were there was a very dominating black nationalist attitude. And those individuals were seen as disruptors and people who were disrupting after the civil rights movement, when you had people who wanted to assimilate. Desegregation was going away. We're fitting into society. They're accepting us. Then you had a segment of people who are like, no, it's not so fast, not so fast. And the children of those individuals became some Crips, some Bloods, and you throw in some drugs, you throw in some guns. I'm oversimplifying it. And this crime bill was actually, if you line it up, lines right up with gangs, crack, and all these things. And you have black leadership basically saying, we can't deal with these individuals. Let's just sweep them aside into jails. And I know I'm oversimplifying, but that's kind of how it worked out.
No, it really is. I mean, you're oversimplifying, but you're not, because it was a very targeted effort at certain communities. We're talking about we all talk about this like it's common knowledge now, but for a lot of people, they're not aware about these sentencing disparities between crack and cocaine, and who was getting hit with the many years and who wasn't. And this is all a part of the way that that wasn't something new. We've been about criminalizing black folk in this country for centuries. And this happened right after slavery. And we know there was a book that came out, The New Jim Crow, a really great book that put the whole conversation in this context. But you have to see prison and incarceration as a way of keeping certain people oppressed very deliberately. And usually it's connected to, I need a labor force. So how can I get it? These people aren't enslaved anymore technically, but how can we do it in an effective way? And this isn't some out there conspiracy theory. It's the reality. Yeah, it's the reality. I mean, but when it comes to Clinton's history, so she's got this history. She's affiliated with all of this stuff happening. I'd still like to think, I don't plan to vote for her in the primaries, but I'd also like to think I'm going to make my decision based on the rhetoric that's being, spread around now. And if she wants to come out and say, look, I screwed up and that crime bill was wrong, and the same way that Bill, her husband, would come out and say all these trade regulations and impacted the world in horrible ways, own your mistake. And then talk about
And
what
you
you
don't feel
plan
like she's
to do.
done that heavy-handed enough yet.
Not enough of a public, serious way. Because look, Bernie Sanders supported that '94 bill too.
Yep.
So again, this is not one or the other. But I'm most listening for what are you talking about now? What's your game plan? And I like a lot of the talk. I'm a little cynical about how much of it's going to really be able to be carried out. Bernie Sanders is promising to end private prisons.
Yeah, okay.
That's
That's
quite
big
a
talk.
promise to
Big
make.
talk.
Right. Tell that
Major
to the
talk.
billion-dollar corporations
Yeah.
who are running Washington in so many ways.
I read Bernie's all of his plans, which are a lot of them are built around taxing major corporations heavily. Like that's where the money's coming from. And I always remember when a lot of these ways to pay for things. Every time a president goes in, they have these ways they're going to tax the big banks, et cetera, et cetera. And always, without fail, it's harder to get credit. It's harder for the small businesses to pay their workforce. Layoffs happen because when businesses can't have credit, they can't front you money as your biweekly paycheck while they collect their invoices to pay their bills.
It's not that they're going to stop making money.
No.
They're going to find ways to save money.
Right.
No, and they're going to
great
slow
point.
credit. The banks slow credit when they don't like, and people always, hey, bro, whatever. I see it all the time. And until the bailout happened, even with Obama, where Obama made it look like, all right, not even made it look like, made it all good, basically, using taxpayer money, then all of a sudden, Wall Street comes back and the economy's coming back. Then all of a sudden, housing and mortgages and home purchases pick up. Then all of a sudden, these deals come back as soon as whoever the leadership is cuts the deals he needs to cut so that you and I can have credit lines, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the one thing that always concerns me about somebody like Bernie is they get in there and the rich people stall them out for the first term. Remember, Obama was stalled for the first term. He couldn't get anything done. He had to cut deals, and that way in year 6, 7, 8,
you can make something.
we actually see something happen. So, and that's my one thing is like, I'm a registered independent, so I don't get to vote in the primaries, but I wish Bernie and Hillary could somehow line up a little bit stronger because we need to make progress, right? Yeah. Minimum wage, equal work, equal pay, funding for public schools. That's one of my big issues. I know we're going off from your book, Incarceration Nation, but I just feel like our public schools don't support the jobs of tomorrow, and you're going to keep having frustrated youth that are going to get out here and have college loans, not be able to get a job, commit crimes, and be in jail. That's just what
it's all
the way
relevant.
It goes.
It's all,
the way it goes.
You can't talk about criminal justice reform and prison reform in a vacuum. It's all part of the same dysfunctional system. So
yeah, particularly if you talk about education.
Incarceration Nation is the book. Anything in this book that we didn't get to touch on today, or do you delve this deep into all of these issues?
I get into a lot of it. I think for people to read the book, well, for one, they should know that the book is very accessible. I wrote this book because I wanted people to be able to learn, but also to be engaged with it and to read it and take this journey and see these places. Because the key is, like we were saying before, these places don't get seen. And if you think about it, what kind of a justice system is something you're supposed to be proud of? Like, you want to wave it around. It's justice. We see this.
The Justice League.
Yeah.
Remember Super Friends? Remember?
Right, exactly.
We like them.
But instead, we keep it hidden in these little dark places. And this is not just true about us, it's true about the world. And so it's kind of critical that if you're going to understand America, if you're going to understand the world, you need to look at what's happening in its prison systems. And that's the kind of picture that I tried to paint in all these different countries. I did get some interesting news as I was walking in here this morning, though, which is that, for years, America has been the model that everyone sort of copies in terms of the war on drugs, in terms of, like I was saying, the models of prisons physically and the whole thing. But now the prison that I went to in Norway, which is certainly the most progressive system in this regard, they do all kinds. They have open prisons where people can come and go as they're serving their sentences, and they
Now, that ain't prison.
Wow.
But it is, though, because they still can't. I mean, they can leave to go to work and then they come back. It's still prison, and it's a lot more effective, right? Because they're still part of their communities. They're still part of their families, who are the ultimate people capable of rehabilitating them.
Now, I'm sure there's levels, right? Like this is just
course.
one
Yes,
level.
this and it's not across the board. Certainly,
Not murder. They don't necessarily have violent
No.
murderers.
I'm sure if it's like
some
drugs.
have committed murder. Yes, absolutely.
There
but
are.
you got to distinguish between a murderer and someone who's committed murder.
Self-defense.
Or
Because-
self-defense, yeah.
But I mean, yeah, someone who's committed murder. Murder is a horrific act any which way you slice it. But there's someone who, in the context of things, ended up committing murder, and that's a horrible, horrible deed. But it's not the same as a murderer whose like purpose in the world is to go around committing murder.
Right.
So that language is really important. So there are people who in Norway who have committed murder who live in these open prisons and go out and come back, and they have jobs and they're productive members of society, but they're still technically in prison. I mean, it's one of the things that Scandinavia does really well. And the Norway system, which used to be like this, oh my God, that crazy Norwegian system, I can't believe they're letting people do this. The head of the prison in Norway emailed me this morning saying that all these people are coming from the U.S. to look at the Norwegian system and think about imitating it and the lessons we can learn from it. He's like, we've never been so popular. Michael Moore actually featured the same prison that I went to in his documentary, his new documentary. It's called Bastoids on an Island. And he said Michael Moore wants to come back in April and do a screening of his film at that particular prison. So it's nice to hear that for once, some of the good stuff that's happening in other countries, that we're not only the arbiters of what's going to happen in the criminal justice system, that we're finally starting to look at other models.
Awesome.
Baz Dreisinger. Am I saying it right?
Dreisinger.
Baz.
Dreisinger.
Baz.
You actually got both names wrong the last time. You went from getting them both right at the start to both Baz Dreisinger.
Damn it.
So close.
Yeah.
Get the book, Incarceration Nation. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for
Thanks for
having
coming
me.
Thank
by.
you.